loses their home. Got it. Okay. And the practices that supported this were the various forms of Sabbath, allowing for gleaning, then principles by which if your neighbor was in need, like they had a bad crop or whatever, you would lend them what they needed, and you wouldn't charge interest. And if they couldn't pay it back, you wouldn't take away their home. That's the way the principle was supposed to work. Over time, people found ways to lose their home, or should I say, people found ways to take away people's homes. And especially as in later centuries, as we got different empires involved and so forth, who weren't particularly tied into the, don't charge interest and don't foreclose kind of ethic, that then a lot of property got grabbed up. So, and it typically, hello, Joanne, it typically followed a sequence like this. You have your ancestral home where you're trying to grow enough to feed your family and also pay a little bit in taxes. You have some bad luck, might be a crop failure, might be a problem with your animals. You had to have at least like a farm animal in order to work the land. Problem with your animal, or problem with family members, or it could even be, like infertility of the humankind, because the whole system relied on you had to have, children to help you work the land and to take it over as you got older. And so if you were a little short on children, it was pretty hard to keep the family farm going. So you had to borrow from someone food or seed grain to get you through the year. And really, it helps to remember that in the beginning, there was no cash involved. It's just all, produce that's being passed around. You borrow, hopefully you can pay it back the next year, or the person you borrowed from is forgiving. If not, maybe you have to borrow more, and then you become more and more indebted. And you might have to start to sell your labor, sell your children's labor, sell your animals' labor, whatever. You keep selling what you can sell until, it's like the point you fold in a Monopoly game. Well, you've mortgaged all your properties and there's nothing more you can do. And so you throw in the towel. Obviously, the more unscrupulous the lenders are, the worse it gets, and more go. So when all options are exhausted, the creditor forecloses and everyone in the family becomes a debt slave / day laborer, often continuing to work the same land, but as a sharecropper, not as owner. So it's very clear that this sequence happened over and over and over again, and that what the prophets often yelled about in the Old Testament was how it was unscrupulous kings and their minions and all the things. So an exercise in interpretation about home building. I was reminded when reading up on this stuff about Psalm 127. It's a nice one. We like to sing it and say it sometimes. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord guards the city, the guard keeps watch in vain. And I always thought that was, kind of a nice sentiment. It had a nice ring to it. It's all about being faithful to God and running a good Christian household. And really the way I've traditionally looked at this, it's pretty much the equivalent of, putting up a plaque on my house, that says, bless this house. I think that's kind of as far as most of us in our nice suburban homes would go with this particular psalm. Go, yes, we have a happy household. We all go to church and we're all good. But once you start reading the Bible with kind of that justice edge to your thinking, you realize, they don't just say this for nice words. There's some justice involved. What are just and unjust ways to build a house? And the prophets help us out some. Here's a couple of passages from Isaiah and Jeremiah about how people are doing things wrong in an exploitative way. Isaiah says, you who join house to house, who add field to field until there is room for no one but you, and you are left to live alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant. So in general, people who become, landlords, developers, bankers, taking property away from people and adding it to their own holdings are kind of getting Isaiah's wrath here. Or Jeremiah, woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbors work for nothing and does not give them their wages, who says, I will build myself a spacious house with large upper rooms, and who cuts out windows for it, paneling it with cedar and painting it with vermilion. These are specifically mentioned as products because they're imports. They're things that people have to go far and wide to other parts of the world to bring in. So they're luxury items. They're not something a person would have just building a house on their family plot. So now, that kind of gives some depth to, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. So kind of in the biblical vision, if you're on your own land, you're building a house, you're for your family, that's building it according to the covenant principles, and everything's cool. But when you're building it with hired labor or slave labor, or building houses that other people will live in, that you're going to sell to other people even, they don't have developers or real estate agents, or those would be dishonorable kind of occupations in the biblical world. So, Isaiah also offers a picture of the vision of how things should be in a just world. He says, they shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity, for they shall be offspring blessed by the Lord, and their descendants as well. So that's a theme that shows up over and over again in covenant economics. Is you're building for yourself. You have the right to enjoy the fruit of your own labor. You're not selling your land. You're not selling your labor. You're not working to benefit somebody else. You're benefiting yourself when you work. And that's, we may find ways to apply that to today. But and then last thing I want to throw out is, I've always kind of thought about, well, what the second part of this, unless the Lord guards the city, the guard keeps watch in vain. And I always looked at that like, well, we don't have guards at the city gates. So, that doesn't really apply to us anymore. So I just kind of ignored that part. And then, I was out walking and I realized we have our modern day versions of this. We have our neighborhood watch programs and we have our gated driveways or gated communities, we have a lot of ways in which we build a house and then try to keep the riffraff away. And I think there's just some things to think about there with, the biblical vision of living together in villages, and yet we report any suspicious persons and activities directly to the police. People, and there's all kinds of problems that can erupt from talking that way too much. So anyway, I wanted to give a little life to this notion of unless the Lord builds the house, and unless the Lord guards the city, and as we start talking about how we deal with home ownership, tenancy, land ownership, and homelessness in our present day world, and think about what the most just solutions to our problems in those areas are, and including whether people actually have a right to a place to live, and how are we going to, if they do, what's the best way to deal with that? So any comments about any of that before we jump into current election issues and so forth related to housing?
It seems to me that when you read those things and you think about what it would look like, basically that's like a socialist communist kind of land reform, and that's completely kind of off the table in our society and our culture. So I don't think it's an unheard of concept, and there are societies that try to have that type of land ownership. But it's certainly not something that the United States embraces in any way.
But I might argue that something like the Homestead Act, that allowed people who lived in the eastern part of the United States and had gone through this and were landless or didn't have fertile land that would support them, were allowed to cross the country and claim 160 acres in Oregon or somewhere in the West.
Indian territory.
Right, that didn't belong to them.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Encouraged to go and steal 160 acres. Yeah, I know. We all feel the same about that.
Well,
I agree that the Homestead Act might have been closer, but that's kind of not in operation anymore.
And it was just that was just a strategy for holding on to that territory.
Mm-hmm.
And then people pretty soon started to create situations where people had to sell that land back to rich people and stuff. So it was just a strategy.
But
Just to kind of put into a little bit of down-to-earth perspective, that once a year, and I think in January, which to me has always been a weird time, we have a point in time count in Portland of, it may be all of Multnomah County, but anyway, of people, unhoused people. And I believe the most recent number was something like 5,200 people unhoused. So thinking about just how do we feel about that? How many people, are people okay being camping in tents on the street? Are we, or should we be okay with that? And if not, how would we, how would we put roofs over all those people's heads?
Exactly. Well, that's the question on the table tonight. Let's talk about the governor's race. Who has some things to say? I think, Di, you were doing some looking at that.
Yeah, I have some. And I will really try not to be too transparent and biased, but it'll be obvious. So I was really curious about how Betsy Johnson feels about this. And I mean, I think that the unhoused population perhaps is number one or close to it in everyone's minds. So all of the candidates were asked, what would you propose about that? Betsy Johnson really believes in coalitions with business and with builders. And so a large part of her proposal or her thinking is that we need lots and lots of housing, something like, an additional 36,000 units per year for the next several years. And her thinking about how to make that happen is to lower the barriers for builders and developers. So make permitting much easier, make zoning much less restrictive. She made a comment that, we should be able to build without having a lot of rules about how all of the things that are built look. And she's confident that she is able to build coalitions with all the relevant parties to create a lot more housing in a short period of time. And I wanted to, if I can find it fairly quickly. I won't be able to find it there. A lot of these things, as you would expect from politicians, is a lot of words. And then I always kind of think, well, what does that mean in realistic terms? How would we do that? One thing that she said, and I can't put my hands on it right now, is that she says, well, camping, oh, here we go. Camping on the streets is illegal. And the law is the law. We now have more shelters for people to go to than we have people willing to use them. But we need to use the law as a tool to drive people to shelters. So her philosophy, her belief is that camping in public spaces, camping on the streets is illegal. And somehow people who are doing that can be forced into shelters and then services made available. I'm going to try not to put my personal comments in here.
So the law is the law for that, but we don't have to worry about the developers' laws. We can just simplify those and make those like go away so that they can build any kind of houses they want as long as they do it cheaply and make a lot of profit. So those laws are not the laws, the law. But anyway, interesting.
Good comment. And Betsy Johnson feels that Tina Kotek has been much too soft on homelessness and soft on a lot of things. Tina Kotek had a bill before the legislature to eliminate no-cause evictions and eliminate excessive increases in rent. And I believe we've had that for a while. And just recently I read that something loosened up on the rent issue, and now some rents are going up 50% and such. Both Drazen and Johnson voted against that bill.
Well, I have volunteered to look at Dan Ryan. He's the commissioner for Portland that's in charge of housing, because I've heard him speak a number of times. I'm sure all of you have as well on the subject. And I find his approach to be very, credible. And I personally would embrace it. He, I think, has credibility on the topic too, because his brother died on the street. He was addicted and tried to get sober, was never able to do so, and ultimately lost his life. So it's an issue that's very close to him. And he takes issue with, I think it's head of Metro that got all that tax money for Multnomah County for the housing issue. And the philosophy of the people governing that fund has been housing first. That before you deal with anything else, get the people off the street and into housing. He disagrees with that approach. He says not everyone on the street is ready for permanent housing, that the working poor and people who are sober and recently have just come on hard times and have not had a long period of time on the street, they can be put into permanent housing of some sort and probably will do well. But that's a small fraction of the number of people living on the street. And he feels that we really need to take the people on the street where they are and try to help them from that point, that view homelessness as a continuum. And it's not you're homeless and then you jump into an apartment and happy ever after, that it doesn't really work that way. So what he's proposing, not that they can continue to camp on the sidewalks. I don't think any of the politicians are saying that's okay. But what he has been proposing has been to create different strategies of shelters, a wide variety, depending on where the person is, where they might be able to be most successfully served. And he wants to have the safe parks, big parking lots where people can live in their cars, live in their RVs, and that all of these safe park places or safe rest or safe camping places would have staff and services available. He said every place a homeless person stays, the people should know their name, that it needs to be personal, and work with them if it's addiction, if it's mental health, if whatever the issue might be, and let them get off the street at a level that would be comfortable for them. And then help them progress to the point where they could get into permanent housing, because ultimately that's the goal for everyone, to achieve that success. But that it's unrealistic, one, to be able to provide that much housing, and two, it would not be successful for many of the people that are currently on the street, that they would be much more successful being able to continue to live in a way that has been, where they want to, and allowing safe places for that to happen. He targeted places throughout the city. He said this cannot be all done downtown. He would have embraced that right, what was that called? Right to Dream 2, Dignity Village.
Yeah.
That's the concept he would embrace, although many of those have been shut down because of the desire for shelter and housing first. But nobody wants it in their backyard. He's had a terrible time trying to get areas in the city that would agree to have these large safe park places, building the tiny homes for the safe rest. There's been some success, but not nearly. The biggest drawback has been finding locations for people to go. However, this last week, Mayor Wheeler came out with the plan where he's going to, within the next 18 months, sweep everyone off the street and force them into these safe camping locations and shelters and different what's available. And those who refuse to cooperate will be arrested and cited. And if they then agree to go into counseling or drug treatment or whatever is, kind of considered necessary, their record would be cleared. So it sounds like that's kind of a more, maybe not a totally different approach, but it sounds like there's a lot more energy behind it and more emphasis. And according to the paper, I'm sure you probably all read the same thing I did, the commissioners, with the exception of maybe Joanne Hardesty, she was kind of on the fence about it, but the others all fully endorsed it, the new plan, which includes building more affordable housing and, kind of the other things. But the big change is making it getting them off the street. So anyway, that was my assignment to look.
Do we know, is there any way of knowing how much of the homeless crisis that we're in comes from simply lack of affordable housing, and how much comes from these other issues? I know that people believe that the homeless folks have drug problems and all these problems that are causing homelessness. And yet, I don't know, that may be just a perception. And it may be that, some large proportion or the majority of the people who are on the streets simply can't afford housing.
I think what
Right.
Ryan would say is that we need to look at that. People tend to either think they're all just really poor and on the street because they can't afford housing, or they're all drug addicts and on the street because that's all they care to be and have no ambition. And what he's saying is it's a much more complex issue in that, and we need to sort it out. And those people who really would benefit from permanent housing have it available to them. Those who need to transition and get support and be able to support themselves in that kind of environment, work with them. He keeps saying when you hear him interviewed, let's take the homeless where they're at and help them work through a healing process with the end goal being permanent housing, but not going from the tent or the street into an apartment with no support service going along with it. And I think he feels there's a lack of accurate data.
I-
5,000 people living on the street. And then depending on who you're talking to, they're all poor people, just need, adequate housing.
Yeah, Diane.
Well, through my work with Family Promise, they're definitely the ones that we work with. There's a continuum of people, and mostly what we've had in the past, the ones that came through our churches and all of that, were people who recently lost their housing. They might have been, sleeping on relatives or friends' couches, that sort of thing, or sometimes in their car for a brief period of time. But through the grants and various things that Family Promise has worked with winter shelters, there's a lot, just a continuum of people from a variety of situations, a lot more drug situation. And also some people are homeless because of domestic violence, and they fled their abuser and don't have a soft place to land. And so there's a whole host of reasons that people are homeless.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I worked at Care Oregon for 13 years and, really dealing with a lot of poor people and trying to get them medical care. And I think there are lots of different kinds of homelessness and different reasons for it. And sometimes it's one thing leads to another. Somebody might be living on the street who's a drug addict, but they might not have been a drug addict when they lost their house and ended up on the street. So, you can't just put people in boxes and figure it out. But I do want to push back a little bit on Janet on housing first. It's kind of one of those nebulous concepts, but it really came out of sort of a pendulum swing away from cities that were trying too hard to put people through all kinds of bureaucratic hoops before they could, find a place for them to live. And so there have been some cities, I believe Houston has a great record on dealing with homelessness, and it's mostly what you would call a housing first strategy, but it's not you throw them into an apartment and not give them services. It's if you can take people and put them someplace where you know where to find them, and they're not roaming from place to place and sleeping in a different park every night, then it's easier to deliver the services they need if they actually have a place to live. And health health issues are also a big part of this. And at Care Oregon, we heard a number of stories about, you know, we were supposed to provide people with their health care, but if they're living on the street, that's a pretty hard thing to do. And so you had, like, you know, someone who's a diabetic or someone who has, you know, chronic health issues, that gets in the way of their being able to get a job and have housing. But certainly if they're living on the street, then it's nearly impossible to control their health issues. So from that perspective, folks were very much in tune to the idea of, let's find this person a place to live, you know, and then we can work on their health issues, and then we can, you know, start to bring them into other things. But and so that's some of the philosophy behind Housing First. It can be done badly, like any other program. And I think Dan Ryan's absolutely right that it doesn't, there's no one size fits all solution to homelessness.
Dan,
I'll say one more thing and then I'll shut up. I did hear a couple of years ago now, I think I heard a radio interview with Homer Williams, who is kind of a business person who's really, you know, tried to take on the homelessness issue. And you might like him or not like him, but he's out there trying. And, you know, he categorized, like, you know, 4 major categories of homeless people. And I don't remember now what they were, but, you know, he made it very clear that his understanding was that there is no one homelessness problem. There's at least 4 or 5 or 6 or more. Anyway, I'll be quiet.
I just wanted to chime in and say, yes, Dan, the city that I heard about over a year ago was Houston. And I just kind of looked that up again tonight because I thought, oh, was it Houston? And Houston was able to get 25,000 people off the streets within, I don't know how long, but a pretty short period of time, and using the Housing First. And my understanding is that they weren't required to be sober. They weren't required to do very much of anything except get into an apartment. And they somehow put people in apartments. I don't think they built tiny houses for them. At least what I read didn't say that. I don't know where they found that many apartments. I mean, we have a housing shortage here. So Houston may be very different from that. They may have empty apartments. We also had mostly out of the metro area, but a thing called turnkey. You remember that, where they were converting hotel rooms into housing? And among the gubernatorial candidates, Tina Kotek says that that was a really successful plan, and she would encourage more of that, unused motel rooms that governments could buy and then use them for housing. Betsy Johnson said that plan, or that program, was a complete disaster, and it's a mess, and it was a failure. So I don't know how to evaluate the truth of either of those. I apologize that I was shuffling pages, but I did remember seeing some statistics today about mental health, behavioral health, those sorts of things. So I'll read those briefly if you'd like.
Yeah.
This is a survey of 300 unhoused people. In Portland, 63% of people living on the streets self-reported. This was a survey by the Oregonian, that they suffer from behavioral health issues of some sort. Of those, 66% reported depression, 65% severe anxiety, 52% PTSD, 27% schizophrenia, 43% bipolar disorder, and 40% a substance use disorder. And they also talked, somebody said this already, they also talked in here about how drug use often is worsened or develops because of homelessness. And even specifically, the thing that I read even specifically said methamphetamine, especially for women, helps them to stay awake so that they don't fear so much being abused or attacked while they're asleep.
Yeah, that's what you hear, is that people don't want to go into shelters because they find the shelters dangerous. So, you know,
They're in all those tiny houses seem like a really appealing idea to me.
Mhm.
But just yesterday, when I was on my way to the airport, there was a tiny house village right beside I-5 on Water Avenue, and like
Hmm.
Morrison and Water Avenue or something like that. And it's gone. It was 2 adjacent parking lots with a whole bunch of identical white tiny houses. And to me, that's a potential good thing. People can have privacy, have their own space, feel safe, and all of those are gone. So I don't know, I haven't read what happened to them, if they were moved or if it was just a bad thing and they were
Neighbors don't like it.
disassembled.
I mean, people,
Well, this wasn't in a neighborhood though. This was,
I
you
think
know,
it was down there close though. I mean, it's not in a neighborhood, but there are adjacent. The school where Sammy went down on the South Waterfront, I think that might have been close to that. And the parents were really upset about that. I mean, that's been the problem with trying to get these, safe parks and places where you can
Right.
have and then Dan Ryan says, but he'll talk to people and say, well, would you rather have them on the street in front of your house or in a place that is supervised with hygiene possibilities and
trash
health?
surfaces.
Exactly. I mean, but they all want it to all be like downtown. Nobody wants it out in there. But his idea is to spread it out throughout the city.
But they want to be downtown because that's where services are, which I completely understand. They don't want to spend all day taking buses to get to services.
Right, except unless you take some of the services out to where they might be.
That's what I'm saying. If these places are, have a staff person there, and then again, the hygiene is so important. One of the hardest things for unhoused people living on the street is bathroom facilities, not to mention laundry.
Laundry facilities, right? The idea is each of these places would have those kind of services.
Right.
And along with staff, social workers and staff.
Yep. Case managers. Yep.
Hmm.
And when in his, in the term housing first, in terms of sheltering first, I think everyone probably would embrace that concept. What Dan Ryan, in my opinion, or my understanding of what he's saying is that he doesn't think all of the funding that came from whatever this tax move, I don't know about it because I don't live in Multnomah County, so it wasn't something I was that aware of, but evidently in the last few years, there was some kind of a tax levy that produced quite a bit of money to go towards homelessness. And the person administering that has really wanted to put it into more permanent kinds of affordable housing. And that's where Dan Ryan thinks the money needs to be used on a greater variety of housing or sheltering kinds of opportunities, and not all into affordable housing. Although he talks about the greatest value of affordable housing being preventative. If people could afford a place to live, you might prevent some of this, and that attention needs to be paid to that as well.
Yeah. It's also true that if you go back a couple of generations and look where the poorest of the poor had to live, there were options that we've kind of like deliberately gotten rid of, like single room occupancy hotels. Most cities have kind of pushed those out, so now they bring in riffraff. So, but there are places for a single person of limited means to have a bed and a hot plate, and we don't have those anymore.
Well, boarding houses, I mean, that was the thing not that long ago, and those just, I haven't heard of a boarding house for in my lifetime, really.
That's kind of what we're talking about, a roof over someone's head and a safe place to be.
Right.
I don't know what happened to those, Diane. If there was a concerted effort to get rid of them because they were objectionable for some reason, I don't know what happened to that whole concept.
Well, I think there are zoning
Seems that it would
restrictions.
be helpful now. Yes, absolutely. There are zoning restrictions.
Well, and that's why I actually do know of a couple of them in Houston because they don't have zoning restrictions. There
Um,
are a couple of boarding houses in Houston in the 5th Ward, which is an historic Black neighborhood. And in fact, I have a friend who lives not in a boarding house, but just down the street from one. And she doesn't complain about any of the stuff that happens there. It's relatively small. There might be 8 rooms or something like that.
Well, some of the things that Betsy Johnson talked about, I read to say that she wants to get rid of a lot of zoning restrictions. And there has been in Portland, or maybe the whole Multnomah County, when I still lived there, it was sort of a shock to some people that a law was passed that I think maybe cities over 10,000 or something like that had to allow 2 and 3 occupancy units per lot on any lot within the city limits. And that was, you know, a horrible shock in some of the neighborhoods in Portland who, you know, those neighborhoods had a different character than that, and the residents didn't like that idea.
I think that's a state law. I think that's.
I think that sounds right.
A few years ago.
That sounds
Yeah.
right.
And
Yeah.
it's trying to push back on, the really exclusive owner occupied small house on a large lot kind of living. And it follows, I think the rules about ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units, I think are Portland specific or Multnomah County specific, but then there is a state law about you can't be exclusively single family zoning. If somebody wants to if there's a lot and there's room to put a duplex on it or whatever, they can do it. And can't
Or a
stop.
tiny house in the backyard.
Yeah.
Going back to the single room occupancy, they have those in New York City. And there's a real, they serve a lot. Not only does it provide cheap housing for people, but they also, the people who live in them watch out for each other. It creates a sense of a community. So it offers more than just shelter. And many of the ones in New York, I mean, I've read about them. I don't have any personal experience with them. People live there for years and years and years. So they really, it's community, and they support one another to the degree that they can. And so I think to make that something and take all those people and put them out on tents on the street, I mean, who gains from that? I don't understand why that's not permitted.
Yeah, and that's an important thing. Community has to be a part of any of these solutions. I mean, that's why people like cluster, have their little camping clusters or their car park clusters. People seek out other people in same circumstance and want to have a community where people look out for each other's stuff and so forth. And when I first started working at Care Oregon, it was just a couple blocks from the Dignity Village one that was at Burnside and 5th. And I would walk by it and it was seemed to be a bustling little community of folks living in tents, and they had a whole little self-government system and so forth. And as you said, the problem is, finding neighbors to buy into the concept and not sabotage it themselves.
Just to bring it home here in River Grove, the tiny cottages idea is really bristling a lot of the neighbors that live in River Grove, which is a community of 550 people. We are the smallest city in the state of Oregon. And when we are in the middle of doing land ordinance review, and this whole ordinance of having the ability to put in tiny cottages or have ADUs, oh my God, you just thought we were bringing in you know, the beast from Revelation. It was just impossible to make anybody have any comprehension of how this could help. And so I'm just localizing it to our own community right here, and kind of disappointed in, yeah, we have a lot of intelligence from surveys and demographics in River Grove. There's a lot of wealth in River Grove. It's not like Oswego, but the intelligence factors just seems to go out the window when they begin to think of, when they don't think of other people and only themselves, and they live on large lots and they don't allow the option. Not everyone wants to do it, but if you're going to deny it for the entire community, then I think that's wrong. And we need to work as we're doing right now, talking.
Michael, what is being proposed that they don't like?
They want to forbid the tiny houses, the cottages. It's a ordinance that would allow us to put an ADU on space that you might have on your property. And they want to eliminate that option altogether. They don't even want it to be an option.
For any purpose. I mean, not like you wanted to put one up there.
I'll use Dan's word. They don't want the riffraff.
Mhm.
But if
And
you
they're
were
not,
gonna-
and they're not careful in how they disguise their language. It's really pretty ugly.
But like, say you and Michael wanted to put one there for a brother that needed a place to live. Would that be
Exactly.
permitted, or you just can't put one up and rent it?
They're limiting the whole concept of ADUs or cottages. If it's not there, you can't develop it, and they're going to eliminate it for any future use. So like if you had, you know, you wanted to provide housing for a college student,
Yeah.
and, you know, that happens in a lot of university towns where people have extra space, and it's
Yeah.
really kind of a nice exchange program for both the landlord or the student or whatever. They get to know older people, and also the older people get to know the younger people and keep up with the times. But there seems to be a denial of wanting to have any communication. And outreach is another word. But anyway, in our tiny town, we have gridlock.
And it sounds like they don't want to attract buyers to property there that would need to rent something out, you know, because that might be considered riffraff too. Not the people they're renting to, but the people who are buying it with the assumption that they could make a little money by renting out a smaller spot on their land. So, yeah. Wow.
Interesting, you know, things you grow up with that you think are normal. When I was a small child, two of my great-grandparents, the two great-grandparents that I had that were still alive that I can remember, both lived in, I guess, what they used to call mother-in-law cottages. My great-grandparents lived just a couple blocks of us from us in Seattle, in a little, I guess you'd call it a tiny house. It wasn't as tiny as a tiny house. It was probably a 800 or 900 square foot house that was on the same lot as their kids. And my great-grandmother in Portland lived in a little house that was off to the side of my grandparents' house in Portland. So those seemed like those were kind of normal and common to some extent. Those AD, we didn't call them ADUs, we just call them great grandma's place. But you know, it's kind of funny how I guess most people didn't grow up with that.
Well, what was the name? I can't think of her name. The woman who lived in Syria for a while, belonged to our church.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah,
What is her name?
You
Yeah.
mean Ellie?
yeah,
Yeah.
Ellie. Well, she moved, her son lives in Hillsborough, and he built a tiny house in
Yes.
his,
Mhm.
I've never been there, so I can't picture it, but what she said, kind of in his backyard, and she's
Mhm.
living in that
Yeah,
very quite comfortably, I understand.
And when she still lived in I don't remember Selwood, or I don't remember where she lived, but she rented out one of the rooms of her house. And it was in part to make money, but it was also in part to have younger people there to help do stuff, just by stuff, I mean like carrying groceries in and that sort of thing. And she had this wonderful multi-generational thing happening at her house.
Yeah.
There are experiments now in co-housing,
Mhm.
which
Yes.
is not really a boarding house concept. It's all separate, but the idea is that you eat some meals together and so forth. And I know some people who are involved in that and who very much want to be involved in that. And seems like we have, not only housing crisis, but an epidemic of loneliness. So, yeah.
Yeah.
That is also true. Yes.
Does anybody have any idea? I mean, any idea of what governmental entity is likely to be able to do something like, is this something that's going to be discussed more at the state legislature level or more at the city of Portland level? Because I'm just wondering, let's say that we have a Republican governor or somebody like that. Is that going to really make it more difficult? Or Betsy Johnson is not going to win. But, thank God. But
Kathy.
But she might keep Tina from winning.
oh, it's a
Yes,
nightmare.
That's right.
It's a
That's-
nightmare.
So
But
frightening.
I'm just wondering where do we think policy or decisions or budget to help with this is going to come from?
Well, I
What
think,
are are we going to have the Republicans walking out of the legislature again if any progressive ideas come up? Maybe they won't be so worried if there's a Republican governor, but hopefully not.
I mean, some of the things that we've already talked about, I think are state laws. I think that the one about no city over 10,000
Yeah,
can limit, can zone such that multiple family units can't be on a lot. But I think a lot of it is city ordinances, I think.
Yeah.
I think somebody mentioned something about this, and one of the pages that I had said that there was quite a bit of money, like 300 million sticks in my mind, that was allotted or is available through taxpayer money to fund some of the things that are needed, and it hasn't been used. It's just,
Family Promise pays for the hotel rooms and that sort of thing from a lot of grants from city, county, state things. And I know that I don't know exactly which grants did what, but I know there was some available for entities like Family Promise to buy hotels to
right.
house people. And we certainly were hoping to get in on that. I don't know what's happened with that recently.
I think that was the turnkey program that I mentioned, that
yeah.
a
Right.
government entity would purchase a hotel and use it for low income or emergency housing or something like that.
Right, probably.
But Betsy
somewhat
Johnson
cheaper
thought
than
it was a
building
disaster, and I don't quite know the details of why she thought that.
She thought what?
It was a disaster.
Oh, it was
That plan was a disaster and would never suggest that it go forward. But,
You'd just be lying.
well, I'm going to tell you
Well,
something
that's
kidding.
shocking about Betsy Johnson, and that is we went to the actual official grand opening of the Research Center several months after it had already been opened. And it was Pete Martini.
Mhm.
Thomas Lauderdale stood on stage, and he is a goodly progressive guy, and said he wanted everybody to know that he's voting for Betsy Johnson. And most of the audience booed, and he said, "I've never heard her lie. She's very transparent." So
Okay,
Anyway,
okay, I
there's
take
that.
it back.
there's
She-
that.
She was, I'm sure, not lying. Maybe she was misinformed, but she was not lying.
Oh, no,
Oh,
I didn't mean that.
please.
I know, I was just saying,
Yeah.
it may be
I'm
shocking.
sure she
how
was
people are
lying.
voting.
I think that Thomas is misinformed. And I think that if he'd listened to any of her ads in the last couple of weeks, he might feel differently now.
when after that concert, I thought I must be missing something. So I went home and read a bunch of stuff about Betsy Johnson, and I thought she's a Republican. I don't know why she's been a Democrat in the legislature, but the woman is a business-friendly Republican. Okay, that's what we need to know.
Gun-toting business.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I was way turned off by some of the early articles that the Oregonian ran. One of them just kind of followed her to when she was speaking in front of a more rural conservative part of the state. She sounded exactly like a Republican. And then they had quotes from when she was speaking to a Portland group, and she sounded much more like a Democrat. So I got a real chameleon sense out of her. And I also, I have a personal thing that I will not vote for any candidate who uses the word woke as a pejorative.
Oh,
And I have heard her do
that's
that.
a good policy.
She was trying to, in front of the conservative audience, she was talking about Democratic policies that make everybody woke and broke. And she thought that was cute and clever, and I did not.
Right.
So.
Okay, no, we're not voting for her, so
Nope.
All
Right.
right. Yeah.
I'll take
Nobody
the
voted
pledge.
already. Yeah, I mean, I have not always been a big Tina Kotek fan, and at first I thought, well, it's nice to have an alternative, but
Scary.
and I think people look at Tina as, the second coming of Kate Brown, and
She's
will
truly
agree that-
trying to distance herself, but I think you're
Yeah.
right, Dan.
Kate's
I don't
not,
think she really is, but we'll see.
yeah,
But
and I don't,
Chance to prove us right or wrong.
I think Tina's a little different personality, and I think she's more of an administrator. I don't think Kate Brown ever really wanted to be governor initially, because she's kind of a lawyer, policy wonk kind of person, and the actual nuts and bolts of trying to make government work was not really her forte. And so I think Tina Kotek is a bit more of a nuts and bolts person, and we may hopefully see some good things if she
It's
wins.
certainly what she's proclaiming.
Yeah.
And she's being critical, like you said, trying to distance herself. But I am really concerned about the homelessness issue, and I'm glad that we're still helping with Family Promise. It's just so difficult, but I do think we have to do something. I mean, things have to change because it is really disturbing, and people, both that and crime are really out of control in Portland. And it's not just publicity.
And it's not just Portland either.
No,
No,
I need to excuse myself. I need
right.
to be somewhere. Thank you, everybody.
I should probably go to.
Di, next week,
Yes.
we have Halloween falls on Monday, and we have book group on Tuesday, which is studying poverty, which is what Jesus said about poverty, which fits perfectly with this class. So I think the decision at this point is we will not meet on Monday, and we will invite anybody that wants to join the discussion, whether they have read the book or not, to join us on Tuesday to talk about what Jesus said about poverty. And
Perfect.
that would be next week's plan. And the other piece of that, Kathy, I want to mention is that since some of us will be like cutting out of choir early to do this on a Tuesday night, that I might see if I can just run into room 7 and fire it up there, and we'll do a kind of a hybrid thing on Tuesday.
Okay. Well, I can try
I
and
would-
meet you over there and set it up in room 7.
I would join you there.
That would be cool if we could do that.
I'd be happy to do that. I'm happy to plan on coming to room 7 and then doing a hybrid thing. That's fine.
Okay.
So that's the plan for next week. Thank you all. Great discussion.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
happy to have
Enjoy
you
your
join us,
neighbors.
Michael.